Hello! Welcome to Sector 666. Today we are looking at a new series of ours called Unfortunate Disasters. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. The Basra poison grain disaster was a mass methylmercury poisoning incident that originated in September 1971 in the Iraqi port of Basra. When Iraq experienced a series of abysmal harvests, its leader decided to import a newly branded wonder wheat from Mexico. A shipment of 90,000 metric tons of American barley and Mexican wheat intended as seed grain arrived that had been treated with antifungal methylmercury to prevent rot. The wheat seeds dressed with methylmercury were sent to Basra in Iraq's south. Because the shipment arrived late, trucks and trains that had been at hand were reassigned. So it took another couple of months before the grain reached the farmers. By then, the sowing season was over. Farmers were left with a pink grain that they were told not to eat, only to plant. But recent harvests had been lousy, and farmers had little or nothing to feed their animals and themselves. This left them dependent on tainted grain for the winter. Many Iraqis were either unaware of the significant health risk or chose to ignore the warnings. The long, asymptomatic latent period of mercury poisoning may have granted farmers a false sense of security when animals fed the grain initially appeared to be okay. The red dye washed off the grain, the mercury did not. Hence, washing may have given only the appearance of removing the poison. However, bad things started to happen a few months later, and hospitals were flooded with patients showing symptoms of damage to the central nervous system. At first, doctors initially had no idea as to the cause. Some suspected an epidemic of brain fever of some sort. Others more accurately pointed to methylmercury. A small group of international experts on mercury was called in, and methylmercury poisoning was confirmed through contaminated food. When the imported grain was identified as the cause of the poisoning, Iraq's government acted decisively. Farmers were ordered to hand over all remaining supplies within a fortnight. A death penalty for possessing pink grain after that date was declared to stress the urgency. But most farmers had no access to radio, television, or daily newspapers. By the time most learned about the order and the penalty, the 2 weeks were gone, and the army had started to execute those found still to be in possession of the grain. So the farmers dumped grain wherever they could, along roadsides, irrigation canals, and rivers. Paresthesia was the predominant symptom in less severe cases. Worse cases included ataxia, typically loss of balance, blindness or reduced vision, and death resulting from central nervous system failure. The poisoning incident was kept quiet by the Iraqi government, and it wasn't until 1973 that an American reporter uncovered evidence of 6,530 cases of mercury poisoning treated in the local hospitals. Iraqi officials eventually admitted 459 deaths, but it is thought that there may have been significantly more. The Gillingham Fire Demonstration, also known as the Fireman's Wedding, was a traditional event that took place at the Gillingham Fair in Kent, England, every summer during the 1920s. Each year, a house of wood and canvas 3 stories, or about 40 feet high, was built in the park as the venue for a mock wedding reception at which 2 firemen, costumed as a bride and groom, would be entertaining their guests. Other firemen, Royal Naval Cadets from the nearby Chatham unit of the Volunteer Cadet Corps, and Sea Scouts. After some time, flares and smoke bombs were set off to give the illusion of a fire inside the house. The firefighters then worked to help the guests evacuate from all floors of the house. Once the guests were evacuated, a real fire was set, giving the firefighters a chance to show their firefighting skills. On July 11, 1929, in Gillingham, after the mock wedding, the 6 men and 9 boys aged between 10 and 14 were ready to enact their staged rescue. However, the real fire was mistakenly set while everyone was still inside. The structure quickly went up in flames, blocking all exits and trapping everyone inside. Other firefighters were immediately aware that they were now dealing with a genuine emergency rather than a demonstration. Still, initially, most of the spectators did not realize anything was amiss, taking the cries for help they heard to be part of the performance, and reportedly cheering and applauding what they believed to be realistic and spectacular effects. Until they witnessed two boys with their clothing ablaze jump to their deaths from the top of the structure. Within minutes, they had extinguished the fire. Unfortunately, the fire was so intense that it claimed the lives of 13 individuals as their families stood by, watching helplessly. 2 victims were rescued alive, but both died of their injuries in the hospital, St. Bartholomew's, for which they had been intending to raise funds, bringing the final death toll to 15. The funeral for the victims was held on the afternoon of Wednesday, July 17th. Some of the boys had been associated with St. Augustine's Church, at the top of Rock Avenue, so a special service was held there in the morning, with the bodies of 5 boys in the church. In the afternoon, thousands of people from all over the country packed the streets of Gillingham along the 2-mile funeral route. The funeral procession was 1.5 miles long. It was headed by 10 coffins carried on fire appliances covered with wreaths, muffled bells, and 5 coffins draped with the Union flag borne on gun carriages. The Shiloh Baptist Church, located at the corner of 7th Avenue and 19th Street, was, at the time, the most prominent black church in Birmingham. 2,000 people, primarily black, jammed into the church on September 19, 1902, to hear an address by Booker T. Washington. The brick church was new. A steep flight of stairs, enclosed in brick, led from the entrance doors to the church proper. The disaster occurred after Washington concluded his remarks. A convention delegate from Baltimore engaged in a dispute with the choir leader concerning an unoccupied seat. Someone in the choir yelled, "There's a fight." Mistaking the word fight for fire, the congregation rose en masse and started for the door. People were trampled to death as they fell to the floor. Others suffocated from the massive wall of people pushing against the church's outer wall. One of the ministers quickly mounted the rostrum and urged the people to keep quiet. He repeated the word quiet several times and motioned to his hearers to be seated. The excited congregation mistook the word quiet for a second alarm of fire and again rushed for the door. Men and women crawled over benches and fought their way into the aisles, and those who had fallen were trampled upon. The screams of the women and children added to the scene's horror. Through mere fright, many persons fainted and, as they fell to the floor, were crushed to death. The level of the church floor is about 15 feet from the ground, and long steps lead to the sidewalk from the lobby, just outside the main auditorium. Brick walls extend on each side of these steps for 6 or 7 feet, proving a veritable death trap. Those who had reached the top of the steps were pushed violently forward, and many fell. Before they could move, others fell upon them, and in a few moments, persons were piled upon each other to a height of 10 feet, where they struggled vainly to extricate themselves. This wall of struggling humanity blocked the entrance, and the weight of 1,500 persons in the body of the church was pushed against it. More than 20 persons lying on the steps underneath the heap of bodies died from suffocation. 2 men who were in the rear of the church when the rush began realized the seriousness of the situation and turned in a fire alarm after escaping. The fire department answered quickly, and the arrival of the wagons served to scatter the crowd gathered around the front of the church. A squad of police was also hastened to the church and, with the firemen, finally succeeded in releasing the victims from their positions at the entrance. The dead bodies were quickly removed, and the crowd inside, finding an outlet, poured out. Scores of them lost their footing in their haste and rolled down the long steps to the pavement suffering broken limbs and internal injuries. In an hour, the church had been practically cleared. Down the aisles and along the outside of the pews, there were dead bodies of men and women, and there were still many injured people among the bodies. The work of removing the bodies was begun at once. In the end, a total of 115 people were trampled or suffocated to death.